Tonight's program has been brought to you by
25 सालों से देश का विश्वसनीय अंकुर लाए हैं आयरन और आयोडीन युक्त नमक। हमारे शरीर में खून की कमी होना एक सामान्य बात है, खास तौर पर महिलाओं और बच्चों में। इसलिए अंकुर का नया डबल फोर्टिफाइड नमक के नियमित सेवन खून में हेमोग्लोबिन की मात्रा को बढ़ाता है। अंकुर डबल फोर्टिफाइड नमक, स्वाद भी सेहत भी। अंकुर नमक, असली नमक। और हाँ, नमक कम ही खाएं, पर अच्छा खाएं।
And now, our feature presentation.
I think it's a brilliant idea to make a movie about Alan. He's embarrassed by it. He said, "What should I do?" And I said, "You should really enjoy it."
He told me that he was sort of reluctant about this project. And the one thing that swayed him was that he really wanted his children to find out what he was doing all those years.
We often say nutrition is both a marker of development, so it's a way of tracking development, but it's also a maker of development. Alan's work was the first to recognize that. I would say hundreds of millions of lives have been improved because of his efforts.
I feel that he's been recognized not enough. Hundreds of millions.
Someone who is, in fact, extremely modest, wouldn't tell you about all the things that he has done. You have to find it out some other way.
What do you know about Alan's work?
So isn't this funny? Very little. And I honestly hadn't known. I know he'd done work and, he'd had a career, but just had no idea. So I don't know if it was after that night or another time I went home and Googled Alan Berg, right? Just because I actually felt silly that I'd never had any sense. I would still say I am unaware.
I met a graduate student who was studying nutrition, and I said, "Oh, my father's a nutritionist. You might have heard of him, Alan Berg." And she said, "Alan Berg, oh my God, the nutrition factor." She's going on, and after a while it got kind of embarrassing. There's a party going on, and she's following me around like a little puppy. And so finally she said, in exasperation, I think at my dismissal, she said, "He's like a god."
It's not common that one can identify the start of a field. But I do think that Alan is deservedly regarded as, the uncle, the father, and the godfather of international nutrition efforts. And one can date those efforts and his role to the book that he wrote when he was at Brookings called The Nutrition Factor.
Alan, and he didn't know this until I met him just a few minutes ago, had a huge impact on my own career. Because this book, The Nutrition Factor, was one of the textbooks for the very first course I've ever taken in development. It was at Brown University when I was a junior, and this was one of the primary textbooks. And so if we read what he'd written, the new interest in nutrition is mixed with curiosity, and the intention devoted to it is often mixed with skepticism. Interest rarely has been translated at the operating level into action. Partly this reflects the traditional view of malnutrition as welfare rather than as a development problem. Now, some of you may know that in 1994, I was part of a movement called 50 Years is Enough, in which we argued vociferously that on their 50th anniversary, that the World Bank and the IMF should be closed. So I was literally on the streets arguing for the closing of the World Bank. And I would say that, that this statement by Alan Berg is exactly why.
I read the book, right? Back when I was in the Senate. And Alan captured a new notion, which was a notion that instead of just growing more food and that was the answer to nutrition, what we really needed is not only food, but we needed the systems related to fighting poverty, the systems related to economic development, to embrace nutrition as part of their enterprise. Because of that book, and because it really was so compelling and made the case so strongly, it sort of was it wasn't like a slam dunk, but it made everybody think, I think, duh, we've got to do this. And so, you know, there wasn't, it just propelled the issue so much faster by pulling it together in such a compelling way.
So his biggest contribution is that he has managed to link nutrition to the overall development effort and to specific projects and activities and programs within that. And that's what the nutrition factor began with, and that's what he followed up on.
Here all of a sudden was this policy implication of nutrition. And I mean, that book really revolutionized nutrition and what we as nutritionists could do, that link with policymakers, what people should be concerned about, the fact that nutrition was a factor in national development was new, amazing, big thinking. But it's more the idea that nutrition, that small nutrients even, have an impact on brain development, on human capital development, on national development. And that kind of research, that analysis, that book was really the beginning of it.
It's been so far ahead of the curve on so many issues, it's really quite frightening. Let me just read a quote. He says, there's new evidence of the relationship between malnutrition of children and mental retardation, and this introduces a new and perhaps frightening note into theories of national development. I would say that's about 25 years ahead of the curve. He's just a fabulous communicator. He writes like an angel. He speaks with incredible clarity. He's committed to sharing ideas and knowledge and information with others.
Communications, or as it came to be called, behavioral change communications, was always very close to Alan's heart in planning and programming, and he began to roll it out in India and went on to emphasize it in the nutrition factor. One of his important discoveries, this is interesting, was that many women in low-income countries were eating not more food during their pregnancies, but less, fearing that a larger fetus would mean a difficult delivery. This so-called eating down during pregnancy called for a particularly creative use of this behavioral change communications.
We were so provincial, and as we grew up, we realized that there's a big world out there. Don't know anybody, never been anywhere, just to Atlantic City. I mean, come on.
It was very exotic. We had elephants and snake charmers, and we could go on trips by train where we maybe saw a tiger.
Most of those people in the Foreign Service had different backgrounds than we had. They were better educated than we were, and they knew what we never heard of the Foreign Service exam until we were about 25. Didn't know there was such a thing. Meeting the Indian community, that was so thrilling. These people in India that we met, they all went to Oxford and Cambridge. They were senior people in the government of India. They oversaw villages, towns, municipalities, cholera campaigns. I mean, they were so skilled. People knew that it was serious and it could affect millions of kids, and starvation was a likelihood, and if you didn't take care, you would doom generations of people. So there was a feeling of urgency.
The first assignment I had when I arrived in New Delhi in November '66 was to go to Bihar, which was the epicenter of a major famine in India. It was always good to check with an independent, authoritative source, like Alan.
When the Indian state of Bihar was hit by serious food shortages in 1966, Alan was given the responsibility of mobilizing international assistance and of coordinating that with the Bihar state government. Interesting that early estimates of persons at risk in Bihar were in the hundreds of thousands. I even saw some estimates as high as 2 million, whereas the actual number of famine-related deaths was fewer than 1,200. And it's now broadly acknowledged that the remarkable famine relief efforts were important in helping to prevent this catastrophe.
When they drove around and starving children beat on the windows of the car, I would say, if you're here to feed them, why aren't you feeding them? And they thought, they couldn't explain to a 5-year-old what they were doing, but after that they started carrying big bunches of bananas and handing them out to satisfy me. Preventing a massive famine, it's incredible. I think it's just incredible.
Among Alan's most valuable contributions was his transformative idea about disaster relief. During the Bihar famine, Alan held lengthy discussions with food and health ministers in hotel rooms and while driving with them through remote parts of the state. And he ultimately was able to convince these key actors that the energy and the resources that were being generated for disaster relief could and should be channeled to address the ongoing problem of chronic malnutrition.
And Alan was very much in the forefront of getting breastfeeding back on the agenda.
When I was in high school, we had a junior year program where you worked on the Hill 1 day a week. So Dad asked Jody who I should work for, and Jody said, a liberal, progressive, young fellow named Ted Weiss from New York. And I worked there, and then while I was there, someone wrote in a question about Nestle and breastfeeding. And boy, Dad was all over it. He dictated a 2-page letter, on all the issues and who's involved and what could be done and how to go about it. And, I sent that up to the congressman to sign, and he was excited. And before we knew it, the congressman was sponsoring bills, and people were coming in the office and they would say to me, a 14-year-old at the time, or 15, it's an honor to meet you.
There came a time that Alan saved my life. I was working in southern Africa, and it was the time when the Nestle's company was in full swing in their very nefarious campaign to get poor women to stop breastfeeding their babies and instead buy this powdered milk. Suddenly my arms were pinned behind my back, and I looked around and there were 2, what I figured were plainclothes police that were about to haul me away. Who is on the stage giving a talk but Alan Berg? And so I just walked with them, holding my hands behind me, into the convention room. I walked all the way up to the front of the room, and I said to Alan, I'm being arrested. I was taken in to be interrogated. What was I doing? Who was I working with? Why was I doing this? And this went on for hours until somebody from the U.S. Embassy appeared with Alan. I knew that Alan had pulled a lot of strings to get me out there, and he did it very, very quickly and very efficiently. And there was quite a lot of press from it, because as soon as I landed in New York, there was press there, and there were people from the international campaign who were there to greet me, and all of a sudden I was some hero instead of being a really dumb American who had no idea that there was a big campaign out there, and I didn't have to work by myself on this.
One of the things he did in the World Bank was to say, look, every agricultural project, every sanitation project, every health project ought to take a look at how that project was going to influence the nutrition of the intended beneficiaries. And that has really not been done before. That's what the nutrition factor was leading up to, and that's what he was practicing. Now, did that have an impact on what IFPRI did, the International Food Policy Research Institute? Yes, absolutely it did. Did he solve all these problems? Is the job done? No, it is not. But without Alan Berg's work, it would not even have been started.
India was in the midst of implementing, but turned out to be one of the most successful large-scale interventions in nutrition ever, called the Tamil Nadu Nutrition Project. Alan, of course, had been very instrumental. Alan's thinking, his ideas, his efforts, his relationships were certainly instrumental. I mean, to all of the work that everybody's done probably for the last 50 years in nutrition, but certainly were exceptionally instrumental to the work that our group tried to do in nutrition as well.
He himself went out and worked on a lot of projects. He got the bank to commit. He got senior people at the bank to commit to do stuff. So he identified good people who were working in the field and moved them around and got them to work on other stuff, building from the bottom up movement. He made a revolution happen.
And of course, malnutrition affects brain development and immune development, and so therefore it affects national development. Even if you have good economic growth, it's only weakly linked to improved nutrition. You really have to have a deliberate strategy to implement programs on the ground that we know are effective. And I can tell you it's difficult to design programs that are aligned with government priorities, that are impactful, scalable, and sustainable. That's very difficult, and not enough people in the nutrition community know how to do that. And so that was something that Alan Berg was saying 30 years ago. Shows you what an original thinker he was. I mean, he thought this way before anybody else did. Way.
Something that Alan was also very clear on from early on was the issue of empowerment of women, and how it really is through education of women and empowerment of women that you could also address the issues of hunger.
Alan's work was really, really important because he was definitely swimming upstream. Now, if you look at his impact at the bank, because of his work, the bank at one point, by around 1990, 95, I'd say, Alan, we'd spent about $1.7 billion on nutrition, which was more than any other organization combined. And it was his influence that did that. He was such a pioneer at the World Bank Group.
I'll never forget being in a swimming pool with Alan back in the 1960s and brainstorming together about which foods were consumed by virtually everyone in India and which could be fortified during processing with needed nutrients. So we ruled out wheat and rice and sugar because so much of those are processed locally. So what about salt? Alan asked. Salt is being iodized, but why not add another nutrient? And why not iron, given the very high prevalence and terrible consequences of iron deficiency anemia? Alan today continues to be the world's leading advocate of double fortified salt.
The story of my involvement with double fortified salt begins with my father and a chance meeting he had on a plane in India, traveling with a gentleman called Jim Levinson. And so when my father said he was on salt, Jim virtually jumped on him. That was the time when Alan and Jim had written what I'd consider a landmark paper called With a Grain of Fortified Salt. That was in 1969, so exactly 50 years ago, which set out the vision for how salt could be such a ubiquitous and important carrier of essential nutrients. And this was a time when nobody really thought about salt in that way. More than 50% of anemia is caused by iron deficiency. It has a whole range of impacts, mainly on women of reproductive age and young children. It has an impact on the health of women, effect on mortality of women during pregnancy and childbirth, mortality of newborns. It also has an effect on the cognitive development of the child. And in later years, it has an impact on their learning abilities and ultimately in their energy levels and work productivity. In fact, there are many studies to show that iron deficiency anemia could result in a 15-20% drop in work productivity.
He and I have been the so-called quality assurance advisors on a review of a program called Scaling Up Nutrition, which is an international partnership to try to promote better nutrition in the world. An example of something that would not be there if it were not for Alan's seminal work and if it were not for his continuing involvement over the years. He was in there having an enormous influence from before anyone heard of nutrition as an area of development and as an important development objective.
A global agenda, which we now have, the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, the objectives of those goals and the different targets set by those goals were the kinds of things that Dr. Berg was doing 20 years ago.
You know, understood marketing, the power of the use of commercial marketing techniques to promote social products and programs and ideas and behaviors. I did something on iron early on with this Venkatesh at MI, and you know, it was to think about doing kind of a global promotional program about the need for iron. Believe me, Alan had as many good or better ideas than a whole team of people working on this. So it's just the way he thinks. He's always been amazingly good at strategically thinking about how to push ideas and programs.
15 to 20 million people in one state, Uttar Pradesh, are receiving double fortified salt now. In India, it's of the order of about 40 or 50 million people who are currently receiving double fortified salt. I'm confident that if we can show large-scale impact in a country like India, it will become that much easier to transfer this concept to other parts of the world. It should reach potentially 1 billion people across Asia and across Africa, where the needs are the greatest, within the next 5 to 10 years.
The journey that his life has taken from growing up in government housing with an outdoor bathroom to have played such a big role and had so many interesting, unusual experiences that he's had a nose for and a kind of discipline for, almost a determination to figure out a way to meet these significant people, have these unusual experiences, and to live a life worth living.
He didn't have a lot of money. His family didn't have a lot of money. And I think the identification with other people all around the world who don't have a lot of money, who may be outright poor, is very strong.
People always ask you, what does your dad do? And that was problematic, because the closest we could say is he's a nutritionist. And that was misleading, because that makes people think of cafeteria coordinators.
Since the 1960s, when Alan started working in nutrition, the rate of undernutrition in developing countries has declined dramatically. The prevalence of nutritional stunting in young children in poorer countries in the 60s was nearly 40%. Today, the rate has been reduced by half or more in many of these countries, surely the result in part of the extraordinary efforts by pioneers and innovators like Alan, along with the great increases in investment.
Now, Alan has done so many things outside of nutrition as well. He is a little broader than that. We're going to talk about any of those too?
It's going to be hard to capture everything about Alan that really is there.
Here he is, this person who is irrepressible and so full of curiosity for life and the richness of life, right? I mean, the abundance of life. I remember we were sitting at Sweet Honey in the Rock, and they have this circle formation as they're teaching songs. And I remember sitting there looking at the joy on Alan's face, that something as simple as this kind of communal singing would bring him. He's always this kind of collector of experiences and beauty and interesting things and interesting ideas. But yet there's a side of him that's so tender and so real.
I was quite skeptical of people who worked at the World Bank because I had a pretty unfavorable view of the World Bank, but it's hard to be skeptical of a guy like Alan. I mean, he's just so full of life, so full of energy, and he would walk into the room and start talking. And the amazing thing about him was that he was so committed to the people and the issues, and the issue of malnutrition. And so all my ideas of what a World Bank bureaucrat looked like were totally changed when I met Alan Berg.
I must say Alan was so different. And I guess his confidence in me emboldened me. That just made me a stronger person to pursue my goals, and that made me a stronger manager and a stronger leader as I excelled, in my professional life.
What a fucking Grammy. That's crazy, but also unsurprising, right?
When Dad turned 70, a bunch of his proteges sang a song. They dressed up like village people, and they sang a song that was based on If I Were a Rich Man from Fiddler on the Roof, and it went like this. Septuagenarian, a nudgy, 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 nudge. All day long it's nudging. So, I mean, in that way, he is determined.
I'm Susan Stamberg, a longtime friend of Alan's, not from the Dayton days, but from the Delhi days. I've had many reactions to Alan Berg. To begin with, resentment. I resent Alan for never having been my godfather, because he obviously has an incredible talent for that, and I'm jealous of all of his godchildren. He is such a lover of them and such a booster of them. Now, here are the things that I love about Alan. First of all, his creativity, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, he's a very serious man, but he has this wonderful sense of humor. He's the best party giver I've ever seen. In Delhi, gave an engagement party for friends, and he had slides of them, which he, throughout the party, had projected against the side of their house. I mean, this was in the 60s. We didn't have computers. There was nothing like that. But also, the outstanding thing about him is putting that creativity to the public good through his work in nutrition and guiding people and guiding societies, villages, towns, countries, nations, to understand those concepts of what nutrition means and how to bring them to bear to serve their population.
After my dad died, Alan really was the only person who remained in our lives. It wasn't only him being there for us, but Alan would constantly tell stories or some poignant memory that really would bring me back and make me feel as though my father was still there.
Alan always had a curiosity that was boundless and a love for other peoples and other cultures. Alan wanted to get out in the field. Alan wanted to eat with the people. Alan wanted to learn from the people. And yet he also dealt with heads of governments and heads of UN agencies.
Alan was taking these really intense black and white pictures in which they were cropped tightly, and they had a presence and a power that no one else I knew was doing. And I think it was interesting that he stopped, and one of the reasons he stopped was I think he started to feel that he was doing sort of cultural appropriation. There was something morally dissatisfying, even though he was getting all these pleasures and taking remarkable pictures. The cover on his book, The Nutrition Factor, is one of the pictures that he took. And it's a powerful picture. I think one part of his journey through his careers is that he wouldn't have been satisfied in marketing plastic. if he was going to work that hard and devote himself, he wanted it to save lives.
If he commits to you as a friend, if he commits to you as a godfather, if he commits to you as a colleague, you know Alan is a stand-up guy who will be there all the way.
It was the good karma that I had to know Alan Berg as an anchor, a mentor, a boss, and how fortunate I was that we were able to perpetuate that relationship into our 80s.
I was a junior officer. I had been assigned to Brazil. It was a big deal to be an African woman in the World Bank at that time, and assigned to a big country like Brazil, and then having to work on this nutrition project, which was under his responsibility. Because I was a loan officer who worked on it, I was then supposed to take this project to the board of directors of the bank. And people thought that I could not make it. I was too junior, I didn't have enough world experience, and therefore someone else should take the project to the board, even though I had worked on it. And I must say, Alan was so different. He looked at it and he said, no, she's going to take it to the board, and I have trust that she's going to do it properly. Yeah. And I guess his confidence in me emboldened me to take it to the board, and it was successful. That just made me a stronger person to pursue my goals, and that made me a stronger manager and a stronger leader as I excelled, in my professional life.
Even though we're almost the same age, Alan really was one of my mentors, and he may disagree with that because he's a modest man, but that is in fact the truth. He had a tremendous influence on my professional career.
He opened a whole universe for me, right? Just the hours and hours and hours he invested in making me feel like I mattered. It's a really big deal.
Alan took me to a poetry event in DC, and yeah, I can say pretty simply that it changed my life. Right after that, I think Alan bought me the book of the poets that read that evening, and I went home and pretty much immediately started writing.
Alan is very generous with his experiences and his wisdom. Imagining the life that you most want to live and the impact you most want to have, and seeing where the need is for that, and vice versa, looking at the world and seeing where the gaps are. It's brilliant. Every one of his jobs he created. There was no position there before. And he was like, this is a gap. It needs to be filled. This is how I can fill it. He always keeps saying, think big, think big. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah. The Godfather Review is a very esteemed publication. Everyone's doing such cool and exciting things. It's very flattering to be in such accomplished company.
Alan is perhaps the most important person in my life outside of my family. It's a very meaningful and powerful experience to sit with him and to have him listen. I wish he talked a little more.
So as a little kid, he'd take you to an art museum that you had zero interest in and walk around and ask you about what you're studying and what you're reading. There's certain things that Alan could invite you to you probably wouldn't have gone to. And I think that has given me an appreciation for anybody who's passionate about anything, and taking the time to share that passion or explore something weird and different with them, because that exploration has value in and of itself.
He embarks on this nurturing a lot within his professional world, so that he has spent a considerable amount of his energy building new leaders and fostering people's careers, because he has naturally understood himself that nurturing new leaders is the way to continue a movement and a vision.
I'm the founder of Calcutta Kids, and we've been running it since the early 2000s, and it's had remarkable successes. Probably the biggest one has to do with nutrition. Through a combination of interventions that Alan has advised on, we've been able to reduce severe underweight malnutrition in our catchment area by more than 75%. So the four major objectives of Calcutta Kids were very much inspired by conversations and the larger sort of history of Alan's work in nutrition.
Alan's fortes are schmoozing and nudging, and he schmoozed everybody into doing nutrition. He's like a behind-the-scenes guy, pushing and shoving and whatever it takes to get people to change. He's incredibly inventive, just able to see the way forward. And then he gets into his schmoozing and nudging stuff, which he's extremely good at. He's also got great political sense and good marketing sense. I mean, he can charm the pants off anybody. So whatever approach he did to get everybody at the top of the bank on his bandwagon, it worked.
He does not come across as somebody who is just doing this for whatever reason, money or otherwise. He's dedicated. He has a very, very nice personality, but he doesn't necessarily suffer fools easily. And that's in his favor, because why should he spend time with people who are not doing what needs to be done? The other point is, of course, Alan is a very modest man.
I had never really met anyone as creative as Alan in whatever he did.
You talk about creativity, you sort of begin to think about the arts and stuff, but it doesn't have to be the arts. It's your thoughts, it's your ideas, it's taking and building something creatively. And anyway, I think Alan is incredibly creative.
I signed up for a course given at MIT in 1971 and walked into the classroom, and there was this very unusual professor standing in front of the class. I think he probably had black turtleneck on and looking quite different. His first question, I think, the first night was, "Why are you here?" It was certainly the most unusual course I had ever taken.
Albania was going through a time their economy broke down, they changed the government. During the time, their paranoia, they built hundreds, if not thousands, of cement bunkers, the little dome-shaped bunkers, reinforced concrete, and people wondering what you can do with them. Alan had suggested that they paint them looking like a breast with the slogan, "Breast is best."
I think a quality of his that's worth trumpeting is his creativity. So as a kid, for me, that meant that he would go out of his way to do things clever and interesting and a little bit off the beaten track. I loved sports when I was a kid, I still do. Maybe my 10th birthday or so, he put together this enormous Olympics for my friends and I to participate in which he designed the invitations, the events, the medal ceremony, you know, with music, with certificates.
Watches and belts? Everything.
We're not really making a movie about Alan. We're actually investigating your ties to the National Rutabaga Association.
No, the NRA.
The NRA, yes.
The NRA.
What do you think made the National Rutabaga Association an effective lobbying group?
2 words, Alan Berg. He was the power behind any throne that they have, and a proud member of the NRA.
He was also the executive briber. If you see down at the bottom, under his signature.
Executive briber.
And that letter is addressed to you, correct?
Yes. This is classified material.
Yes. My question is, as an investigative journalist, have you ever accepted any gifts from Alan Berg, the executive briber?
Rutabaga pies.
Aha!
Rutabaga cinnamon rolls.
Oh, I see it on the cover now.
Now he's
Absolutely.
getting into it.
A cover boy.
We came by and there's Eleanor down on her knees, and you know, she's getting dandelions out of the yard. And so I actually came up and says, "Eleanor, what are you doing? You're not dressed up for Easter." And Eleanor looks up and says, "Ashley, you know we don't celebrate Easter," being Jewish, of course. And she says, "Oh yes, I forgot. You're a Democrat." I mean, the background of this man is just incredible. Just absolutely incredible. And he's a PhD, did you know that?
No, I hadn't heard that yet.
Yeah. That's a pretty hot Democrat.
It was Passover, so we invited Alan to come and join us for a Seder, and he always brings a small gift, something very unexpected. And this was for the kids, and we opened it up, and it was a teeny little frog.
The dog would come to our house wearing a yarmulke. So that's Alan. He put the yarmulke on the dog to make sure somebody in our house was religious.
I got married in secret. All my Italian family, my kids, didn't know about my wedding, so I was just in secret. And we went with my husband for 2 days in New York. And Alan and I, we have received just the newspaper, New York Times, every single day. And it was the Sunday edition. And they say, "Oh, Renato, I put your newspaper just in your house. Yes, my key. So in your house, don't worry." "Oh, thank you. You are so kind. Thanks, so kind." And then when I came back, I received just a text. "Have you seen the New York Times?" "No, I never seen the New York Times. I just came back now." So I opened page number 4 in your New York Times, and I found a photo of me and my husband in New York, and just a big article saying, "Finally, they got married." I said, "Oh, God."
He asked me to work with him on a National Academy of Sciences food and nutrition project. It was a volunteer project, and he was heading it up. And he asked me to draft a letter to experts around the globe who might answer some set of questions we posed about what needed to happen in order to improve world nutrition. So I drafted a short letter, and it had to go through channels at the National Academy, and Alan took that process through. And he came back to me and he said, "Well, we have a little bit of an issue." I said, "Well, what is that?" He said, "Well, the letter's fine, it's been approved, but there's one problem. They don't want to use the word maven." And I said, "What do you mean they don't want to use the word maven?" He said, "Well, it's Yiddish." And I said, "It is?" Because as a Jewish girl growing up in New York, I had no idea that maven, which means expert, was Yiddish. But the National Academy was for blunget, and they didn't want to go with the word because it was Yiddish. So we had to take out the word maven.
In my childhood, I had a stack of Playboy magazines. I think I was 14 years old or something. And I had passed them on to my friend Avi. And he was caught with them by his parents. And in the intervening week or so, my father had heard of this, and he wrote Avi a letter from the local police department that he signed off as Lieutenant Benjamin Greb instead of Berg. And he, of course, being Alan, he found the proper stationery for it. He put it on a certain letterhead. He made it look very official. He sent the letter by mail, and Avi was absolutely terrified when he received this letter that he had done something that was actually against the law.
I can't think of a more persistent person. He is incredibly determined. Once when I was living in Israel, he came to visit me in Israel, and we were down in the desert somewhere. And then he remembered that there was a project going on somewhere out in some remote village, and he decided that now would be a good time to visit the project. They said, "No, there's no chance. It's Shabbat, people are off, we don't have a translator." And this went on for hours and hours, and sure enough, by the end of the day, there we were in a taxi rumbling across the desert with translators and all sorts of people.
A little motorcycle, and they are really in such a way, and this is how the mind of Alan is working in a really quick way, sneaking and so on. This is Alan in a mental way.
Those little tuk-tuks in a developing world where one driver has a passenger and he pays no attention to the traffic rules.
I would say a public bus. He's a real Democrat. I think he appreciates being with all kinds of different people and being exposed to interesting, spontaneous situations, and likes a little bit of unpredictability and a little bit of craziness. and a little bit of sense of being part of the community.
One of the new electric bikes that can now speed up beyond 45 miles an hour, because it's very quiet, and he is very quiet about his accomplishments, but he moves very fast, and he's actually pedaling as he goes. He doesn't sit back and let other people do the pedaling.
A very fashionable car that operated on solar energy and would run forever.
I think we could all use more Alan in our lives.
Some of these untold stories and unsung heroes of development that need to come to people's attention. Not only is it important in terms of valuing the major contribution they made to a better world and to better living conditions, but also it sends a good signal to many others.
Malnourished people tend to be malnourished in many ways because fundamentally they are without power. He doesn't pull his punches. He feels that being polite about malnutrition is malpractice. When we see things that are not happening, he's brave enough to stick his head above the parapet and say something. And even though there might be personal consequences for him and his career and his reputation, I really admire that, and I try to emulate that as much as I possibly can, as much as my bravery will allow me to do so.
He speaks truth to power. And of course his intellect, he's got this fantastic intellect. He's able to conceptualize things and then turn that into implementable action. And that's really, usually you have people who are really good at one or the other, but not both.
And he's a real mensch. He's a very faithful and loving friend. But how he makes things happen, it's charm, it's commitment, it's perseverance, it's trying to convince people that it's their idea rather than what a brilliant or persuasive fellow this Alan Berg is. But don't get the idea that Alan was a one-man band. He was able to have this huge multiplier by getting everyone wanting to do more, wanting to do the right thing. And that's so much more important than the gifted individuals who go in and say, I set up the XYZ project in such and such a country, and I'm the one. No, Alan had a huge multiplier effect.
We really need his voice. Alan's all about getting things done and making things happen. And I think he knows how to operate behind the scenes and how to pull the levers and the strings that need to be pulled to advance nutrition. Alan's always been about advancing nutrition rather than advancing himself or even advancing the World Bank.
There was one day when he took me out to this countryside in Virginia, and it was really beautiful. We bought sardines and bread, and we got in the water and just laid there for a really long time. It's floated in this pond, and it was just the two of us. We were just this old man and this young boy floating in this pond in Virginia in the middle of nowhere, eating sardines. I remember even thinking that at that age I was pretty young, and I remember thinking that it was so nice that Alan still appreciated doing simple things like that.
I'm grateful to him, but I'm also grateful for this project because I think it serves both sides. It serves his irrepressible side and it serves his vulnerable side. And I think that that's a nice way to honor someone.
When I first met Alan, sitting in the sun, his eyes on Mother India, but his mind on everyone. He was looking for answers, looking to the sky for a way to put the smile back in a hungry child's eye. I said, it don't make sense to me You ain't no smiling saint. You come here on an airplane from a foreign government. I see you work with computers. I see you wear a tie. Then how can you put a smile back in a hungry child's eye? He said, that's a good question. I often contemplate the poverty of India. Oh, it's such a guarded gate. So what's our contribution? Where do we draw the line between the dream we want to realize and the price of doing time? The price of doing time.
Just say to Alan, I'm so glad that I was able to be a part of his team. I'm glad that I too have come a long way and have had some success. And I want him to please know that he is a part of that success, because in the days when my own professional path was unclear, he helped to give me the confidence to be able to open it.
So last question is, why did you agree to participate in our making this movie?
It's mandatory. Staff said I had to do it.
Gotcha.
And I drug my feet, and then Frankie found out, and she's the boss.
Yeah.
And she says, you have to do this for Alan. I said, I don't have to do anything for Alan. All he does is just berate me all the time. She said, now come on, do this movie. We love the Bergs. You know we love the Bergs. I said, my God, I'm a busy man. Here I am, the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, number 3 on the Finance Committee, Health Committee, Healthcare, Taxes, Agriculture, World Peace, whatever. I'm on the Rules Committee. I'm frankly too busy to do this.
I'm sorry.
But for Alan, I love you, man. Love you.